2018 is the start of the US semiconductor embargo on China. And for me, the reason I think it matters is severalfold. First, of course, it really marks the breakdown in the US-China relationship. Up until that point, it was essentially what you had between the US and China was a trade war. They were like, oh, you got to buy more from me and I'm going to put tariffs on you. And, these are the kinds of things that happen, but it doesn't create lasting tensions, lasting ill will. With the tech war, like 2018 moves the trade war into a tech war, where all of a sudden, if you're a Chinese leader, you start to worry, hold on, the US is blocking me from semiconductors because the US doesn't want me to grow anymore. So if they're blocking me from semiconductors today, tomorrow they might block me from chemical products or from auto parts or from energy, from any number of things. I therefore need to get self-sufficient very, very quickly. I also need to develop other trade relationships very, very quickly, whether with Russia, whether with Iran, whether with anybody who I don't think the US will be able to put pressure on. Because if you go back to the semiconductor embargo, what was quite surprising and somewhat shocking to most people, it's not just that the US said to US companies like NVIDIA, you can't sell chips to China, but the US said that to Tokyo Electron, and they said that to Samsung Electronics, and they said that to ASML. Everybody was told, you can't sell stuff to China anymore, or face the consequences, which will be massive US sanctions. So all this to say that I think it was a super important development because it meant that if you were China, all of a sudden you had to very rapidly move towards self-sufficiency. You could only afford to rely on people who wouldn't be bullied by the United States, and that's only a handful of countries. So it completely changed the economic equation for China. And I see, you see this very clearly in the bank lending data. Starting in 2018, bank lending to real estate, bank lending to the consumer absolutely craters. And instead, all the bank lending goes to industry. It's almost as if the government told the banks, guys, from now on, we're only putting our money into industry because we need to essentially de-Westernize our supply chains as quickly as possible. And this very decision was massively deflationary for China and for the whole world. It was deflationary for China because it triggered a real estate bust, property companies going bankrupt, lower commodity prices. But it was also very deflationary for the world because as China poured all of its savings into industry, what you saw was China move quickly, very rapidly, up the value chain in autos, automation, robotics, railroads, nuclear power plants. I mean, you name it. Essentially, anything linked to transportation, anything linked to automation/robotics, and anything linked to energy generation, energy transportation, energy storage. China poured so much money in this that in the space of 7 years, China ended up leapfrogging the entire Western world. And so here we are today. We wake up to a world where China produces nuclear power plants that are better and cheaper than anybody else, where China produces cars that are better and cheaper than anyone else, tractors, solar panels, you name it. China now is producing better and cheaper goods. The train was on the track in 2014, but 2018 gave it massive urgency. So I think in 2014, what you have with the Made in China 2025 program is a statement of intention saying, look, we're going to go over there. Which is what, 5-year plans are for, and which is how policy happens in China. So it was very much a case of, look, we do want to go over there. We want to produce our own cars and we want to produce our own tractors, etc. But in 2014, there wasn't the element of we're going to do this at the expense of everything else because it is now a national security imperative that we do this. In 2014, it was we're going to do this but we're still going to have, money going into real estate, and we're still going to have money going into consumption, and we're going to have a pretty balanced economy. This is the direction of travel. We want to head over there, but again, not at the exclusion of everything else. By 2018, with the semiconductor embargo, it's almost as if, okay, we have to do this right here, right now, and that means no more loans to real estate. All the money's got to go into this. So you're right that in terms of direction of travel, it didn't change, but in terms of the intensity of the policy, 2018 marks a very profound shift. If you go back in time, so, the semiconductor embargo happens in late 2018. And so it really starts to unfold in 2019. And then you start to see, the puzzle pieces come into place. It's like, oh, the Chinese real estate is really starting to roll over. Capital to the property developers is really being starved. So you start to see the puzzle pieces come into place. But then 2020 comes around, and of course, COVID happens. And that, upends everything. For like 2 years, all people talk about is COVID. Nobody's talking about Chinese policy anymore. And so, I think it's only when you come out of COVID in 22, 23, and when people start traveling again, and as people start to travel again, they go to places like, South Africa or Brazil, and all of a sudden they're like, wait, all the cars are BYDs. Like, how did this happen? Like, last time I came to, if you went to Brazil in 2019, there were no BYDs on the road. You come back in 2023, and a third of the cars are BYD in Sao Paulo. And you're like, what just happened here? And so I think this is when the eyes, at least of people who wanted to see, who were trying to understand what was going on, around 2023 is when most people start to realize, hold on, something is happening with industry in China. Because of the chain of events, it was actually pretty easy to miss it. All of a sudden, you had the absolute collapse in loans to real estate, and you had a surge in loans to industry went up like 7 or 8 times, which, I've never seen in any economy anywhere. So, going back to my business partner Art's point on subsidies, etc., I think you have to remember that in China, the way policy work isn't so much the government, central government writes a check, hey, BYD, I want you to produce electric cars. Here's a check, go produce electric cars. The way policy works in China is very much through local authority levels and through local banks. So what happens is the central government will say, you know what, we want to produce electric vehicles. So, they'll get all the provincial governors, the party secretaries, the mayors in a room, and they'll say, guys, the future is electric cars. And so now if I'm the mayor of Wuhan or the provincial governor of, Zhejiang, I know that to get my next job, I need to produce the best electric cars. That's what they just told me. That's now in my KPIs. I have to produce electric cars. So I go back to my district, to my city, to my province, and I talk to the local entrepreneurs and I say, hey guys, I've got a plot of land over there. If I give you that to build a car factory, and I call Agricultural Bank of China to give you a loan to build a car factory, will you do it? And so this is how you end up where we are today with 100 EV producers. And so this started to happen pretty visibly in 2019 in a lot of industries. Going back to EVs is the easiest example because we see the cars and we know some of the brands. I'm not going to claim I know all 100 of them, but if you'd asked me in 2018, 2019, how many Chinese car brands there were, I would have said, I don't know, 12, 13, 14. I would have picked a number around then. Except by 2019, the number was already like 50. And by 2021, it would be 100. So and then you look at, loans to the car industry and all of a sudden it's surging. So you're like, okay, something is happening here. Because, this is how, and you can replicate that model, of course, for the battery makers, and you can replicate it for the tractors and for, so earth moving equipment and so on and so forth. So all this to say that to answer your question, how do you know where things are happening? We spend a lot of time in our little shop looking at bank loans. I think that's a pretty clear indication. A lot of the loans are politically motivated. So it's a pretty clear indication of where policy wants to go. Now you could say, yeah, that's great, but it's a bit delayed. You get the bank loan data 3-4 months later, et cetera. And that's true, but it's better than nothing. And so, so to answer your question, that's how you knew it was happening. And at the same time, if you're a bit of a car guy, you'd like, hold on, like this is a new brand. If you do go to things like the Beijing Auto Show or the Guangzhou Auto Show, And all of a sudden you see that there's 3 times as many, companies there. And again, I think most people missed it because while 5 years ago, a lot of guaylos like me might have gone to the Beijing Auto Show, during COVID, you couldn't, right? I mean, there wasn't even a Beijing Auto Show during COVID, but during COVID, like a lot of the things that you would normally do to sort of understand what's going on, i.e. go on field trips, meet with companies, talk to business leaders, none of these things were really possible. So the way I look at it is in 2018, President Trump punches China on the nose. And China wasn't expecting the punch. And they take the punch and they realize we can't punch back. Because if we punch back, he can ban us on so many different things. Like, if we try to fight back on semiconductors, he might ban us on chemical products. At the time, China was a big importer. And, so they were very worried. So they took the punch. Biden comes back in 21. And I think there was this hope in Chinese policy circles of thinking, well, we've known Biden a long time. He's visited China a bunch. He was Obama's vice president. We go way back. This will be better. And you had the Anchorage meeting with Blinken and Sullivan that was an absolute disaster. It was an absolute disaster. It was actually worse than any meeting they'd had with Trump. And on the other side of that, the Biden administration actually increased the embargoes on China. So China doubled down on the industrial policy. So again, they get punched in the face, and again, they can't fight back. So to your point, what I've said in some pieces is, having gotten punched twice in the face by 2 different presidents, you go to the gym and you train hard. And so Trump comes back, and going to the gym and training hard means de-Westernizing your supply chain, means making yourself, taking out all the vulnerabilities in your economy. Which is where you are today. My colleague Tom Gatley wrote a great piece recently highlighting that Chinese exports have gone through the roof in the past 3 years, really. And usually when Chinese exports went through the roof in the past, imports would also go up because, if you are going to export a lot of cars, you need to import a lot of copper, and you need to import a lot of rubber, and you need to, before you transform it into other things. Now, of course, China is still importing commodities, but a lot of the things that China would have imported in the past, say chemical products, like you want to build a car, there's about $2,000 to $3,000 worth of chemical products in a car. And in the past, that might have been provided by DuPont, by Dow Chemical, and now no more. Now it's all being produced in China. And so it's fascinating because China's exports are booming, but its imports are not. And so the trade surplus is getting bigger and bigger. So that's what I mean when I say China went to the gym and got fit. It de-Westernized its supply chain. And then what happened, Trump comes back in. And when Trump comes back in, he's obviously angry. He feels that, foreigners haven't given him the proper respect, etc. And so he doesn't just punch China, he actually punches everybody. He punches Europe, he punches Mexico, he punches Japan, Korea, Canada. He punches, he's like a drunk in the bar. It's like he's fighting absolutely everyone. And this is when China, because Europe, Canada, they weren't expecting to get punched by the US. Like it was a big surprise to them. Now, remember, China got punched twice in the past 7 years. So China has been ready for this moment. And so when Trump finally punches China and says, more tariffs on you, I'm going to increase the embargo, China says, fine, you want to do this? Let's go. Gloves off. You want to have a fight? You tariff me, I tariff you. You embargo me, I embargo you. And then the US realizes that without the Chinese rare earths, without the Chinese magnets, the US can't produce weapons, the US can't produce cars. And meanwhile, the US might think that banning China from the high end of semiconductors is a way to bring the Chinese economy to its knees. But meanwhile, what you've seen is the release of DeepSeek, the release of Quen have shown that even at the very pinnacle of technology, i.e. AI, even at the top, China can actually be competitive without access to the US semiconductors. So all of a sudden, the relationship shifts. And you saw this very clearly in South Korea when President Trump met with President Xi. what were the two topics of conversation? The two topics of conversation were TikTok and rare earths and / magnets. Both of these, if this is the topic of conversation, you're playing straight into Xi Jinping's hands, because Xi Jinping can give you TikTok or he cannot give you TikTok. What does he care? He's not a shareholder in TikTok. He's not trying to sell TikTok. And if the US decides to shut down TikTok, well, that's going to be a big problem politically for Donald Trump, because young people are going to be very upset at him. Meanwhile, on rare earths, same story. If that's the topic of conversation, that means that China's already won, because China controls all the card. It can decide to give you rare earths, or it can decide not to give you rare earths. If the topic of conversation is rare earths, and if the topic of conversation is TikTok, that means that the US is asking for stuff for China to give. So it's a completely 180-degree relationship from 7 years ago, when 7 years ago, China was asking, please, can we have the semiconductor machines? Please, can we have the semiconductors? And the US were saying, no, you can't. And so the relationship has now shifted 180 degrees. And so that makes for a China that can also shift its policies domestically, because it no longer really needs to protect its economy from potential US attacks. Essentially, what China did was mobilize its massive savings, because China does have massive savings, and again, took it all from property, took it all from equity markets, and put it all into building industrial supply chains. I mean, look, during that period, there were barely any IPOs. There were barely any corporate bond issues. It was, we take all our money and we put it into our industrial supply chains. So what was the end result? The end result was property prices went down by a third. Equity markets essentially went down by 2/3. It was a brutal, brutal time. It was very deflationary for China. Growth went down. Nobody had wage increases for 7 years. And this had real societal consequences. The marriage rate collapsed in China. The birth rate collapsed. China, pre-2018, China was having 17, 18 million births a year. Now you're down to 9.5 million births a year. It's almost halved. So China took a lot of pain to essentially, free itself from the possibility of US reprisals. It took a lot of pain to de-Westernize its supply chain. And so today it's interesting because, following Seoul, the US turns around and says, hey, you know what? We're going to de-Sinify our supply chains. We're going to build our own shipping industry. We're going to build our own rare earth industry. We're going to build our own aluminum industry. We're going to build our own chemical compound industry for drugs. And each time, every one of these things is $500 billion, $1 trillion. And, the US is proposing to do this at a time when government debt in the US is, pretty much at record highs, where budget deficits are 6% of GDP. They're roughly $2 trillion a year. And so the US is going on saying, we're going to spend $1 trillion to do this, $1 trillion to do that, $1 trillion to do this. So if they do that, that's money that's going to come from somewhere. And then, it's so either you're going to print the money, but then you already have a 3% inflation rate. So if you're just going to print the money, you could get into a strong inflation situation very quickly. Or the money's going to have to come from out of the stock market, out of the real estate market, essentially what happened to China. And so, China, the population took it on the chin. They as they say in Chinese, 吃苦, they ate bitterness. They had the 1/3 drop in real estate, the 2/3 drop in equities. Can the US accept such an outcome? I think the US cannot accept such an outcome, partly because the US is a much more over-financialized economy relative to China. There's a lot of leverage against asset prices in the United States, much more so than in China. And the US valuations of assets today means that actually economic growth is highly dependent on assets. Now, if you look at the Buffett indicator, today the market cap of the US is more than twice the level of GDP. So if equity prices go down 30%, that pushes the US into a recession. It's almost mathematically. So all this to say that, China took a lot of pain to de-Westernize its supply chain. So if the US want to de-Sinify its supply chain, it will need to take massive economic pain and financial pain to do so. Alternatively, it can turn around and say, you know what, let's make peace with China. Let's turn the page, move on. And, I think U.S. policymakers have realized that they don't have much of a choice, because any policymaker that imposes a 1/3 drop in real estate and a 2/3 drop in equity prices will be kicked out of office long before the positive fruits of such a policy, i.e. the designification of the supply chains, long before the positive fruits of such a policy appear. You'll have lost elections. You'll have been carted off. So all this to say that, I think all roads lead to the reality that the U.S. is slowly starting to realize that they really have no choice but to get along with China. It's, look at my own country of France. We used to be nuclear world leaders. Growing up, and it was the one thing that essentially, the one issue that united left and right. Everybody agreed, from the Communist Party to the far right, everybody agreed, except for the Green Party, that essentially represented 5% of voters. Everybody was pro-nuclear. But because essentially you needed the Greens, and the same story in Germany, because you needed the Greens to make coalition governments, that 5% or 10% of Greens essentially, as a price for their participation, got, essentially Europe to sacrifice its nuclear industry. And so, France, we used to be 90% of our electricity came from nuclear. We're now down to basically almost 50 now. And this, by the way, very much happened on Macron's watch. And, this was amongst Macron's many policy disasters, this was probably the biggest one of them all. So if you're Europe and you start off with, you already have, one of the highest costs of labors out there, because there's the wages, but on top of the wages, there's all the social spending and the social taxes that employers have to pay, et cetera. We have an office in Paris. When I employ someone in Paris and he costs me 100, the reality is he costs me 200 because there's all these taxes on top of it. So you start off with that. You start off with also highly unflexible labor laws. If somebody's not working out, very hard to fire, et cetera. So you start with that. Then on top of that, you throw the highest cost. So on top of the highest cost of labor, you throw the highest cost of energy. That's the kind of the straw that breaks the camel's back. And it essentially leads to a collapse in investment. With a collapse in investment, you get a collapse in productivity, and you get weak growth. And so that's where we are. Now, against this, I still think there's some absolute world-class companies in Europe, even in spite of all of these problems. But a lot of these world-class companies are essentially multinationals. Your Siemens, your Air Liquide, your Schneiders, world-class industrial companies that increasingly produce less and less in Europe. Or if they produce still in Europe, they increasingly produce in Eastern Europe, where the regulatory, backdrop is much less. Where you look at Poland, for example, Poland is very happy to burn coal to provide cheap electricity to its companies, and so on and so forth. So the story of Europe is death by policy suicide. It's a terrible thing to say, but there you go. You can't have the highest taxes, the highest cost of regulation, the highest cost of labor, and the highest cost of energy and expect a positive outcome. It's just not going to happen. Maybe the Ukraine war will be the end of the European Union and the end of NATO. When you lose wars, there's usually political consequences. World War I, when World War I ended, by the end of World War I, the Russian Empire had gone, the German Empire had gone, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire had gone, and the Ottoman Empire had gone. And so losing wars make for political upheavals. Now, the whole point of NATO was, back when it was built in the 40s, 50s, 60s, was to protect against Russia, back then the Soviet Union. It probably should have been disbanded in 92. It didn't really have a main purpose anymore. But, we said, okay, well, we'll keep it as a buffer against Russia. And now, NATO had a chance to prove its worth against Russia and didn't really work. So I don't know. I think, and NATO is now being undermined on the U.S. side as well, where essentially the U.S. is, with their new national strategic review that came out on Friday, they're essentially saying, look, Europe, you're going to be on your own pretty soon. So And, if the U.S. walks away from NATO, like, it's kind of a worthless institution, because then you're left with the reality that within NATO, you only have a couple countries that still have real armies. Like, does France need to be allied with Luxembourg and with Belgium and with Holland, when these guys, or Portugal or Spain, like Spain actually has a decent army, but none of these other guys really do. So bottom line, on the other side of this Ukraine war, there's a possibility that the EU does not survive. The extent to which, the general EU institutions in Brussels just kowtow to whatever the US says and does. To say that Europe has become a lapdog to the US would be, I think, an insult to dogs. It's absolutely mind-blowing to me. We just saw it again with the National Strategic Review. Essentially, the U.S. spits in the face of Europeans, and the Europeans turn around and say, "Oh, this is a nice shower." Yes, logically, Europe should, given how it is being treated by the U.S., Europe should be turning around and saying, "You know what? We are going to follow our own policies vis-a-vis China. We are going to follow our own policies vis-a-vis maybe Israel. We are going to follow our own policies vis-a-vis Russia." I mean, the U.S. is following its own policy now vis-a-vis Russia. Bottom line, logically, that's the path it should go. I think there's sort of embedded inertia within the halls of European power that, the inertia is, we're best friends with the U.S., so we'll do whatever the U.S. says. That inertia has built up over the past 20 years. But it's an extremely destructive inertia that should be challenged. But who are the European politicians challenging that today? The answer is that there aren't really any. The U.S. is starting to talk about a G2 world. That's what Trump talked about when he was in Busan. I think the U.S. realizes that having a confrontational, conflictual relationship with China actually underserves U.S. interests. And so, you had a period of 20 or 30 years where people were talking about Chin America, like it was integration of these two economies. Then you had a period of roughly 7 to 10 years where the economies were pulled apart, very conflictual relationship, etc. And I think we're coming to the end of that period. Now, I don't know what's coming next. I'm not saying we're going back to Chin America, but I also don't think that, I think both China and the U.S. want to work towards a more constructive, positive relationship. It doesn't mean that you go back to keep growing and the integration of the two economies together. But I don't know if we're moving to a world where it's going to be, fighting each other for influence around the world. I think at this stage, it's increasingly clear that the U.S. has said, "Look, Latin America is mine." It's pretty clear that Africa at this point is China's. It's pretty clear that most of Southeast Asia, most of Central Asia is going to be China's. Europe, it's not even obvious that it matters all that much over the long term. So it's, maybe you have a world with different zones of influence, but it doesn't mean it needs to be conflictual. So first, on the investability issue, Chinese equities have been terrible returns. Chinese fixed income has been terrific returns. And I always highlight this, that, if you look at the past 3, 5, 10 years, Chinese bonds have absolutely crushed the returns of Chinese equities. So it's, I think as a default, most investors look at everything through the lens of equities because, we all watch CNBC and we look at the tickers go by. And it's also easier because it corresponds to companies that, we interact with. So Facebook or Amazon or Alibaba or Tencent. And so you like, oh yeah, I compare Amazon's done much better than Alibaba, and Facebook's done much better than Tencent. But I would first I would caution that in the U.S. what you've done is you've essentially sacrificed the bondholders for the equity holders, and in China you've had the reverse. Now, where do we go from here? I think in China, there's increasingly a willingness to, maybe not sacrifice the bondholders, but definitely goose up the economy. Next year, the Chinese budget deficit will probably be 10% of GDP, thereabouts. So they're stimulating much, much more aggressively. Now, I think the other thing, we can go down that avenue on the bond versus equities. We can go down the avenue on what policy going forward looks like. We can also go down, frankly, the avenue of the transformation of the Chinese economy, which for me is perhaps the more interesting thing, the more interesting development as an investor. And that, I think if you go back 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, it was very hard to make money in China as a company, because if you had a successful business model, somebody would come in and compete with you immediately, because you were typically operating at a fairly, low margin, low barrier to entry business. You were in manufacturing, or you were, it was all sort of pretty low end. And so, again, you'd get tons of competitors. Now, what's fascinating with China's big push into industry and China's massive improvements in education, what you've witnessed is transformation economies. And perhaps the best example of this is BYD. You go back 10 years ago, BYD made very crappy cars. The idea that anybody with money would want to buy a BYD would have been laughable. But you fast forward to today, and arguably BYD now makes the best cars in the world. Whether it's the super high-speed cars, like you want the fastest car in the world, it's made by BYD. It goes 495 kilometers an hour. You want a Land Rover type car that can float in a river for 30 minutes. That's BYD who makes that. You want a car with a drone that goes ahead of you, so that if there's deers on the road, the car gets a warning and automatically slows down. That's also BYD. So, and how did BYD go from here to there? BYD went from here to there because today there's 120,000 engineers in BYD's R&D department. Now that's a mind-blowing number, 120,000. To put things in context, there's 80,000 workers at Tesla. So we're not talking about, forget the same ballpark. It's not even the same sport in terms of R&D, and the idea 10 years ago that BYD could make original products or would have 120,000 engineers in its R&D department would have seemed laughable. And again, so, when you look at the Chinese equity market today, and you look at what's happened over the past 20 years or 30 years, you're comparing apples and oranges. It's not the same thing anymore. The biggest LiDAR company in the world with more than a third of the global market share is a company called Hesai. And 5 years ago, to put LiDARs on cars would cost $50,000 to equip a car. Today, to equip a car with LiDARs costs $200, and thanks to Hesai, it costs $200. So the cost has gone from $50,000 to $200. It's down 99.5%. And this is kind of mind-blowing, because it completely changes the economics of everything. It used to be that LiDARs was all about, we're going to use them for autonomous driving. Now we're entering a world where every car is going to have a LiDAR for safety. It's going to be like the airbag, because a car with a LiDAR is much safer than a car without a LiDAR. And so just like you have to have an airbag, people are going to have LiDARs. And so you look at a company like Hesai, these kinds of companies didn't exist in China 10 years ago. Companies that, were at the forefront of technological innovation, at the same time at the forefront of manufacturing, because these are two separate things, but doing them together, you do them better if you do them together, at the forefront of manufacturing, and that own basically global markets, and do this while maintaining pretty good margins. So you now have, I think in China, 15, 20 companies that are absolute world-class companies that dominate their market both domestically and internationally. And this is something completely new. Again, this did not happen. You did not have this 10 years ago. So, on the whole China investability thing, I think, people look at the past and project it in the future, even though you can see with your own two eyes the dramatic transformation of the Chinese economy. And so, people say, you're saying it's different this time. But I invite people, I say, come to China and tell me it's not different. Go see these companies and tell me it's not different, because it is. So look, I went to university in China in the early 90s, in a vain attempt to learn Chinese. And when I was there, China was graduating roughly 350,000 university students a year. China now graduates 12 million university students a year. And, almost half of these are in the STEMs, are in the sciences. So either engineering, maths, physics, chemistry, mining engineering, all these things. Now, here's the fun bit. I invite you to go to Imperial College in London or to Purdue University in the United States or any of the big engineering schools and go into a classroom and you'll find that half of the students in the classrooms are also Chinese. The other half is Indian. So in the Western world, I think we have this delusion that, yes, tech matters. Of course it does. And yes, we will dominate tech by essentially attracting the smartest Chinese and the smartest Indians to come work in the West. Because that's what we've done really for the past 25 years. Look at, the entire AI team of Facebook is Chinese. Like the entire of Meta, the entire AI team is Chinese. And so I think there's still a bit this delusion in the West that, Chinese people and Indian people, they all want to come and work here, which, it's true. Like the US still has a terrific ability to attract top talent. Having said that, that gap keeps on narrowing because the quality of life, the quality of life in China 20 years ago was terrible. You lived in Shanghai, it was polluted. There was nothing to do on the weekend. It was super lame. No good restaurants, you name it. If you have money today in Shanghai, and you don't even need that much money actually relative to say New York or San Francisco, you live like a king. You live like a king. And so you are starting to see more and more people come back, which is, perhaps also something that people underestimate when they look at China. And here I'll use the biotech experience as an example. Out of nowhere in the past 15 years, China has built up a massive biotech industry. It's now outperforming the US biotech industry. Now, fascinatingly, a lot of the guys worked in the US and came back. They came back because, lots and lots of reasons. Perhaps also the US is becoming less friendly to foreigners. I think if you're Chinese, if you're Indian, the US, 20 years ago opened you with welcome arms. Today, that's not really the case anymore. So it's a number of little factors. It's not one thing. It's a number of little things where it's nicer to live in China now. It's nicer to live in India. It's very, very expensive to live in the US. You as a Chinese or an Indian, you're not really treated very nicely anymore. It's like it's one thing after another, and then people move back. And as they move back, it helps the domestic growth, et cetera, et cetera. So again, I things are very fluid. It's a constant. Things are all constantly changing. But I would just say this: the markets, they can sense that out. And so you look at the past couple of years, Chinese biotechs have massively outperformed U.S. biotechs. Chinese tech is starting to outperform U.S. tech. In Chinese industry is massively outperforming U.S. industry. And meanwhile, the framework of everyone's point of reference is China's uninvestable and US is exceptional. But eating away underneath, you're already starting to see in the markets the relative shifts of performance. First, we have to start off with the simple reality that the US won the lottery of life and has basically pocket aces. If it was a poker table, the US has pocket aces. It obviously can't be invaded by anyone. It has pretty much all the natural resources it could possibly want. It has a network of rivers through the Mississippi that allow you to move goods around at very, very low cost on barges. And it has an institutional makeup that is very, very robust in terms of guaranteeing personal freedom and liberties, independence of the justice system. It has so many comparative advantages. It, of course, has the advantage of having the world's reserve currency. It has the advantage of I think people underestimate what an advantage the Chapter 11 is in terms of, having very sound bankruptcy law that allows you to transfer assets from, weak hands to strong hands very quickly. So I could go on. The list of advantages that the U.S. has is enormous. So I think you never want to, completely lock it away. Now, having said this, how much of that is priced in the market? How much of that is recognized by the market? The reality today is that we're 15 years into a bull market in the United States, and the U.S. is very richly valued relative to everywhere else. But, even beyond valuations, and it's very richly valued against its own history, but even beyond all of this, I think the bigger issue is, that the longer a bull market lasts, the bad actors don't get punished, right? And a bull market that continues attracts con artists, it attracts hoodlums, it attracts all sorts of bad behavior. And I think you've seen a lot of that in the cryptos in recent years. But when it comes to this kind of behavior, it's what John Kenneth Galbraith in his book called the bezel. You have essentially dodgy characters that come in, and that doesn't happen at the bottom of markets. That happens at the top of, that happens as the bull market lasts. And I wonder if in the U.S. we're not reaching the points where the bezels are starting to appear. This was pretty clear. It's what Warren Buffett said. It's when the liquidity comes out that you see who's been swimming naked. And you're starting to see some of the private credit guys implode. Private equity is struggling and having to postpone returning capital to shareholders. So it's event after event where you start to wonder, okay, are the bezels starting to emerge in the system? Meanwhile, if you were running a dodgy business in China, you've been starved of capital between 2018 and 2024, so you've already gone bust. And to some extent in Europe as well, you've been starved of capital. So we're entering, I think, the phase in the markets where you are going to start to see the more dodgy business models implode. And that essentially that means you're going to get more scandals in the United States than you are anywhere else. So cyclically, structurally, there's nothing wrong with the U.S. per se. Cyclically, I think it's a dangerous place to invest.